Thank you all for being with us tonight, and also huge thanks to Colin for the acceptance of the invitation to be a part of this lecture series. Colin is an artist, composer, choreographer, and performer. Their practice works in environments for expanding consciousness, questioning the binarities and boundaries in the field of perception, communication, singing, or vocal practice in general, and body experience. In 2018, they released a solo album, Siblings, toured internationally with Holly Herndon as a part of the choir, worked as a choreographer for Dan Deacon's videos, and last but not least, developed a group singing practice called Choir with X that we will discuss more during this talk. And now I would like to leave the floor to Colin. So welcome and thank you.
Thank you, Jan. Hi, everyone. But yeah, thank you for having me. And I'm going to just kind of hop in, and then I'm going to try to leave some space at the end in case anyone wants to have any conversations about things. But maybe we start with, I'm just going to jump in. Yeah, so I want to sort of start with this kind of concept of being autonomous together, which we'll get into later, and maybe point out a little bit of a pathway that of how I kind of got to doing and making the work that I am doing nowadays, with I guess emphasis really being on yeah, this idea in which we can maybe be together autonomously as individuals, and maybe there's a way along the path for me to explain yeah, what that actually means. This is like a picture from one of the siblings performances. Everyone's kind of this alien choir. This is a kind of performance extension of the choir. I'm also going to try to not ramble too much because I have a tendency, time and I have a really funny relationship. So I'm going to ask time to be on our side today and work along with us. So I grew up in the Pacific Northwest and in Oregon, and went to school at a state college called Evergreen in Olympia, Washington, where I originally went to study puppetry and experimental writing. And it was kind of in this underground queer DIY space that I started making these performances with my friends, kind of getting into, I mean, I guess I could say I moved to Olympia, Washington specifically because there was a rich queer feminist underground scene there. And all of the sort of, I guess, like pre or early internet, all of the things that were really exciting about being there kind of happened in these like basements and living rooms, and from people who were sort of just making things up as they go instead of sort of taking a sort of route of professionalism. And even the Evergreen State College very much kind of encouraged myself and others to write our own curriculum. So I was from an early age starting to sort of draw together like texts and media references from my own research, which also I appreciated. This is like a little clip of me performing in 2006. I'm gonna watch just a tiny bit. Let's see if it works. Keep your eyes off of me till you know just how much I feel inside of me at this moment. And, you know, I was like really into Tracy and the Plastics and Anna Oxygen and The Blow, and really identified with this kind of, I don't know, a lot of queer women from that scene, I guess. And this kind of, then I dropped out of school. I started making music and performance, and I think was starting to hang out in different groups that worked with collaborative systems and started just getting into this idea of bringing friends into my performance practice and giving, being a kind of platform for other people to build stories together. This is still from a movie that I made back in 2008 called Ghost of Shauna. There's my friend Molly. It's like about a ghost that, yeah, so maybe I don't need to get into the narrative. And then I think a part of this process also turned into like this idea of collectively authoring and collectively storytelling when creating these films and performances. So maybe it's hard to read all these things, but this is essentially from this kind of group writing exercise where there was like a group of people in the room and we're kind of writing these texts together, kind of like in a collage or exquisite corpse way of kind of storytelling. And so then once these kind of names and stories were sort of built, then we figured out how to sort of put them together into a story. And that became the first movie I made called Avid Diva, which I guess it's kind of a movie. And it's not like, anyway. Then I moved to New York and I started throwing queer parties, mostly because there seemed to be in New York, or I think as with any city, there always is like a kind of dominant narrative of what is cool or what is like exciting there. And I wanted to create a kind of, I just noticed also that New York was really obsessed with coolness or like being successful. And I thought that was really funny. So I was like, oh, what if I started a party called Clump? Because clump is like such a disarming and silly and kind of gross word. And we used to throw these parties like Night of a Thousand Bjorks. And we would have, you know, essentially our little underground. And then over time, it kind of grew and grew. And it turned into one of those things where like the people who I feared from like the cool kids populations would like show up to my parties. And I'd be like, what are you doing here? You're like, I'm the dork or whatever. But this gave way to a project called Clump TV, which was kind of about platforming the community of people who were like attending this queer party and creating a kind of, like a video platform to sort of introduce all of the people of this world that had given so much to me to the rest of the world. So we would do projects like this, like group dance. I don't know. There's all different. It's all of the Clump TV stuff is on my website if you want to dig in there. And it was fun times, good stuff. I was a part of a boy band. Maybe I'm gonna go over that. No, I have to spend that much time on that one. And around this time, I started being a part of maybe my first real art collective called Shade Deep. And Shade Deep was kind of built out of this time in which I think RuPaul's Drag Race was really starting to become a main, like a really vivid public representation of the drag world, which was very much about like competition, domination, becoming a brand, becoming like an entity that could be for profit. And Shade Deep as like a kind of queer family, as a drag group, or what we called ourselves like post-drag, or someone else said post-drag and it kind of stuck one day. We were very much into this sort of like horizontal and like non-competitive form of creating drag, and also like stuff that extended beyond sort of cisgendered men dressing up in drag. So I think this also was a gateway for multiple members of the group to come out as trans or non-binary. And so there was very much something about this kind of space of play together where we were able to also co-author these spaces with each other. There's me doing a little performance. Here's kind of all of us. And then with our drag godmother, Linda Simpson, on the far right. Maybe then, so around this time, working with Shade Deep and collective organizing, I had started making these operas, not having any previous experience in making opera so much as I just and sculptures and kind of multimedia work, so much as I just was into the sort of potential of bringing a lot of people together to make a performance. Again, kind of not from a place of knowing much about how operas get made. Let's see if we can spot it. Anyways, it's very religious. Now looking back on it, it's so religious. This resulted in me making my first record, Elation, which was very much kind of culminative from my experiences of working collectively. And at the end of the Elation series, we kind of landed on Siblings, which was really kind of centering the narrative of like a non-biological family, specifically this performance being about asking the question of how this group of characters would survive on a damaged planet, something as a kind of proxy to Earth or something like that. So that was sort of the segue. I guess the last two pieces, also the Fool, this one that we have a picture of here, is the kind of segue to talking about choir, which will be the sort of like central part of maybe what I'm going to talk about. And you can see me in the middle on the bed. My friend Raul played the role of the dog, kind of walking around. This was the first time I had made a performance kind of utilizing a choir or as like a collective author of a performance work. At the time, I had also just discovered Bread and Puppet Theater and was into this idea that you kind of make a bunch of people make something together with each other to tell a story through puppetry, through these kind of big gestures. Maybe we don't need to watch a little clip that's on the internet. You do. So part two is about building a choir. I think first we have to maybe have an understanding of what a choir is. This is also a performance from the Siblings show with that same ensemble. I think this is Berlin. Yeah. So choir is a non-utilitarian group singing practice rooted in somatic research and experimentation. I wrote that choir is a mutating evolutionary platform because I'm noticing that like as I kind of do these, as choir continues to live, the sort of definition or the language around it continues to change. So in this way, choir often feels as though it's adaptive process or practice, something that will transform over time. But this idea of the voice being at the center on an individual and a collective level, curiosity and exploration being over expertise and professionalism, this collection and distribution of activities is important as a way to explain that choir is not mine, although I'm the facilitator, that it's meant to sort of be operating as a distribution of tools that anyone can kind of use and misuse. And we'll maybe get into that kind of fractal part of choir later. And choir is a workshop to practice being autonomous together, advocating for creative practice of collective sound making beyond the quantification of value and the world of recorded music. And we'll get into that later. So this idea of being autonomous together means working and acting collectively without a striving for assimilation. So whereas a lot of kind of group work that happens, especially when it comes to group singing, is about the sort of like standard SATB organizing and about memorizing and reciting sheet music, choir is really about everyone kind of coming into the space, having a different experience in relating to their voice and relating to maybe a somatic practice. But that this plurality and multiplicity of everyone coming in from a very different life experience is actually what makes choir so special. It's this kind of, dynamism that has made it, I think, something that has persevered through the years. Choir is very much like something that I didn't anticipate to have continuously happening in my life, but there's a kind of, I guess, unexpected desire or need for it in certain ways. So I like to say that choir utilizes the voice as open source tools for individuals to interface, to transform, to mute, change, and discover the ways of listening and producing sound. So much of what choir is for is about not just producing sound, but understanding the way that we actually perceive sound and voice. We'll get into this later. So to borrow kind of from Adrienne Marie Brown's emergent strategies, I kind of built these four central things about what choir is for, what it does. So often if someone's like, I want to lead a choir session, these are maybe the points that I give them. The voice is a foundational instrument of learning and transformation. Group singing and vocalizing are open source activities for exchanging emergent strategies. And when I say that, it means that there's a sort of opportunity within every choir session for any participant to try out something, utilizing the kind of material of the collective to experiment. Collective organizing can exist beyond systems of quantitative or qualitative measures of success or effectiveness. I'll get into that later. By learning internalized systems of perception through the presence of safety cues, experimentation becomes a method for healing. So this is the first picture from the first choir session that happened back in 2013. And at the time, it wasn't even called choir. I think we were calling ourselves like a vocal coven because we were all kind of witchy in some way. And it was more about the sort of, I don't know, creating exercises for using our voices together and getting into the sort of like tangible physical experience of just being voices in a room. And especially I think as queer people, as some of the attendees were starting to transition or also take hormone replacement therapy, that there was a place for them to sing and use their voice that didn't have to worry about following like an SATB structure. So something that has kind of happened over the years too is that as a kind of instigator, a person who starts choir, like a bunch of people who've attended choir sessions have gone on to kind of create their own thing. So we have sessions happening in like Washington. There's some that happen in Tehran, in Rotterdam. I get messages from people saying like, hey, I'm doing a choir session this week. And some of these people on this list were kind of original members of when we started choir, and then other ones are sort of, attendees that have come over the years. Here's from one of the choir sessions. Someone made this really beautiful little rooftop. I also like this thing of, choir is rarely recorded. I try to not record choir sessions for the sake of us not having to think about that. But when you see the sort of environments that people build for group singing, I always really appreciate that. Here's one in New York. So a big part of choir also is born from this place of Zomia, which my friend Kai Altman introduced me to. Zomia is a sort of like mythic or maybe like a misnomer for a part of the world that has been like dominated or taken over by different forces, but that at one point Zomia was essentially, I mean, the X or the Z are kind of alternate spellings of it. Choir gets its X from this Zomia, which was essentially this part of the world in which when there was sort of like the birth of, or the beginning of a lot of colonial forces, that there were groups of people who moved to the mountains or moved to different parts of the world to sort of resist or be ungovernable. And that as a sort of like, I think Kai as like an ancestor or like having an ancestral relationship to Zomia very much identifies with this kind of idea of the ungovernable being something that we actually inherit and hold, and that we're often looking towards finding our way back to those like ungovernable ways of living in like a highly governed and surveyed world. And in that same breath, yeah, this idea of choir really being about not taking the precomposed world to be the precedent by which we make and do the things that we make or the art that we create. And that by doing so, we'll get into this idea of safety cues later, but this idea of creating safety cues allowing others to experiment, explore, and create, heal the rift. So there's kind of like 4 anchors of research. I mean, these things are kind of ever changing as choir becomes the sort of like envelope for a lot of my like collective practice that I work with. And we're going to kind of just go through these 4 somewhat briefly to sort of touch upon maybe the like main reasons, kind of like those 4 points that I showed on that yellow slide. So the first of which is Colin Oliveros, who was a composer and artist who has been deeply influential to me in my practice, who talks about deep listening being this kind of bodily practice in which you're listening, or this listening with the entire body and not just the ears. And I really appreciate the sort of expansive idea of listening, not just having to do with even something that we're doing with our body, but maybe something that we're doing beyond our body, that listening is this sort of extension of ourselves that can affect what's happening around us. Yeah, there's really this thing here about improvisation, collaboration, and playfulness. I think so much of why choir works for people often is that we are rarely given opportunities in our day-to-day life to do deep listening. So I'm always trying to incentivize a deep listen, however that can happen. Second is this essay from Anne Carson called The Gender of Sound, which I love, which in some ways shows different stories that have existed throughout history that point towards the way that our listening is very gendered, and that we hear on a somatic and an auditory level voices, and we internalize, we either do or do not listen based on if a person's voice sounds like crazy or worth our energy. You can think about when you're walking down the street, the different voices that you hear and the ones that you might try to tune out, or the ones that you maybe really easily feel like dominate your attention. And that this kind of essentially the same violences that exist in terms of like misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, racism, classism, all exist in how we listen. And that I have this deep curiosity if we can develop tools for unlearning these value systems that are embedded in how we listen, not just to voices, but in sound altogether. And third is this kind of somatic research of doing choir, this kind of cognitive thing. I want to really quickly talk about the vagus nerve, which is like, this is a nice 3D image of it, but it's kind of here in the back of your head. And the vagus nerve goes all the way down through your throat. And it goes all the way down to all of your vital organs. And the vagus nerve is an autonomic central nervous system, which helps regulate how we process stress and trauma. It also helps the functioning of our vital organs. So everything from our breathing to our liver, kidney function. And in reading this book by Bessel van der Volk about called The Body Keeps the Score, as I was like reading through these very, very challenging stories about people who are living with PTSD and trauma, that one of the few ways that people are able to essentially heal this rift is through the kind of activation or reteaching the body through the activation of the vagus nerve, or what's called like polyvagal theory. And yeah, and then a sort of extension of that is just this thing that we're living in a world in which like every part of our cognitive being is essentially, or like our attention is constantly being kind of tipped away by like corporate platforms. And that choir is often about setting up a toolkit of cognitive resistance to be able to kind of protect the brain, protect the body through the sort of, or not even protect, but I guess more like sustain, to make the extreme present something livable, and that doing so can be a social activity. I don't feel so much like reading all of the things I wrote. Here's a really helpful, I always think that actually there's this, they say you can't be what you can't see. I always think that it's really helpful to see the vagus nerve laid out this way, where you can sort of see that, it's the only central nervous system that runs through the throat, that is really affected by breath and voice. And there's something about paying attention to like an image like this, where you can really begin to understand, where those nerve endings are, how it relates to when you're having a fight or flight response, or when you're able to be relaxed. There's the kind of like dorsal and ventral, fight or flight that we have with our central nervous system when you're like in a state of fear. And one of the exciting things about the vagus nerve, or something that is kind of slowly appearing through different scientific research, is that you actually can't feel curiosity and fear at the same time. And that through the vagus nerve really being the thing that regulates either fear or curiosity, there is this thing of building strategies to make the body curious. So for example, a friend of mine who teaches meditation will have us in choir sessions do these grounding exercises where you anchor, a single breath to 5 objects in the room, 4 physical sensations, 3 sounds, 2 smells, and a taste. And just by doing this kind of anchoring to the physical reality around you, you can usually calm down the fight or flight response. I'm not a doctor. I'm just putting that out there. But I like to quote doctors when doing these types of things. The most important function of the vagus nerve is afferent, bringing information to the inner organs, such as gut, liver, heart, and lungs, to the brain. This suggests that the innermost organs are major sources of sensory information to the brain. The gut has the largest surface towards the outer world and might therefore be a particularly significant sensory organ. This is from one of Bessel's writings. But I also like this idea that choir is in some way connecting to intelligence or knowledge in the body. It's like not always up here, that like our bodies actually retain information. And then for the sake of time, maybe I just say the last kind of reason why, or what I like to point out with choir, or why I try to incentivize choir, is that so often in creative ecologies, in the world of being an artist, we're always working towards professionalism. And there's this kind of perpetual demand to be like working on a forward progress of like, oh, I'm going to make money off of my art. I'm going to be more successful. I'm going to get accolades. And how often the kind of modalities of working towards financial or quantitative success is counterproductive to the sort of imaginative practice or the sort of playful practice that exists in a kind of music scene or in a music world. And I mean, I think I'm old enough at this point that I've seen multiple music scenes kind of like, they can easily be decimated by like when dollar signs become more important than, you know, doing something special, meaningful together. So yeah, like how it becomes this question, how do we survive and sustain imaginative practices in this shift from the analog to digital? How do we manufacture alternatives that don't deny the existence of digital cultures while also not letting it dominate or destroy creative relationships? I think all of us can agree to some degree that like if you make something, we're kind of trained at this point that like, oh, I have to share it with the world. And that's one of the reasons why we often don't record or even take pictures or videos of choir, because it is very much a rare, or like it, I want there to be more circumstances in which people feel an incentive to be creative without recording. I'm gonna then segue now to the DAO. How are we on time? Not bad, actually. So the DAO, or a decentralized autonomous organization, is anyone familiar with DAOs? No? We're just gonna go into this really briefly, but I've been trying to sort of ask myself this question about how something like choir relates to Web3 and the sort of internet that's being cultivated right now that exists outside of sort of the corporate internet. So if Web1 was the sort of open space of the internet before there was the mega corporations like Facebook and Google, Web 2 is really the like domain of like a single internet in which like you have countries which maybe their entire internet is only Facebook, or that, you know, this thing of like WhatsApp, Instagram, and Facebook all being Meta now, where it's all kind of, and it's this question of how do we, in Web 3, if that's Web 2 and we're building Web 3 right now through a lot of decentralized internet, decentralized networks, how do we sort of create a proxy like this in physical space? So also, why do we want decentralized autonomous organizations? This is one of my favorite choir picks. So I'm, you know, one of those moments where I'm like, oh, I wish we did take pictures sometimes. So a DAO, maybe before we get into why a DAO, I think of this Starhawk quote all the time, which is talks about in ecological systems, the greater the diversity of the community, the greater the its resilience and adaptability in the face of change, and the greater its chance of survival. And from there, we can start thinking of a DAO or a choir as a kind of proxy or example of a physical space version of what a DAO is. So a decentralized autonomous organization is an organization represented by rules encoded as a computer program that is transparent, controlled by the organization members, and not influenced by a central government. Choir works as a physical representation of a DAO, operating from these same principles, but offline. As an extension of Pauline Oliviero's Software for People, we can imagine a circumstance in which we become familiar with the DAO through group singing as a choir. So this is a sort of extension of this idea of the body being software, that like, you know, when we are living our day-to-day life, there's certain things that I like to use this kind of metaphor with my friends where we talk about like uploading and downloading, and we'll be like, oh, I'm really downloading right now, I'm really uploading, because that language somehow really makes sense when talking about processing information, processing experience. Shuman Basar, I think that's how you say Shuman's name, Shuman Basar, this writer talks about this idea of the extreme present being this kind of confounded three presents collapsed onto each other. And with an awareness that things are only going to continue on this kind of accelerated path that we're on. And I often then think that one of the most beneficial things we can have in living with the extreme present is a set of tools for interfacing or sustaining yourself. And this is a Donna Haraway quote. I feel like I really Donna Haraway out the last few years. I just like literally everything she had said. There's some people who don't love Donna and her writing. I find her to be very, very inspiring. But in all of this, in the sort of like physical to digital question with something like choir, I think about this sort of quote where she talks about it matters which stories tell stories, which concepts think concepts, mathematically, visually, and narratively. It matters what figures figure figures, which systems systemize systems. All the 1,000 names are too big and too small. All the stories are too big and we need stories that are just big enough to gather up all the complexities and keep the edges open and greedy for surprising new and old connections. And this is where I start to connect the sort of choir scenario. What is that? Do you think it would be able to make a super qual? Oh, a super qual small choir session at the very end about recording? Maybe. Yeah, let's talk about it. I have to see how we are on time, but that's possible. So, you know, as a performance maker, so often what I'm trying to sort of build on a stage or in a studio with other people as not just a choir practice, but as a performance maker is essentially a physical DAO. So this idea of a platform by which everyone is able to sort of self-govern and have different experiences while at the same time participating in a bigger platform or developing something with each other, in which everyone has a kind of like ledger of trust in the group that we're all working on something together. A lot of the time, I try to take this kind of format or way of being with people and extend it to an audience so that there's not just a sort of central figure or like these pictures that we saw at the beginning of the presentation where you had a bunch of people on stage. I often like to invite a public in for, you know, a short duration of time to sort of extend the sort of choir practice or this group practice to platform people to participate in something temporarily. It's just another interdependence isn't always glam. I'm just gonna leave that where it is. Yeah, here's another example from one of these performances. And a kind of like other early version of a DAO or something that I want to kind of name these as like failed projects, but in the way that I think failure is a really important part of collective work. I had a couple friends commit suicide over the course of a couple years, and it really started making me wonder, specifically when I was living in New York, how hard it can be, and how do we just sort of like disseminate information to provide an easier life for people, and not one that has to do about money or like things that cost a lot. And from there, we kind of developed this, I think 250 plus people participated in like adding to this How to Survive Winter in New York document, which was unfortunately on Google, but felt very much like a kind of predecessor of something that is maybe still in process or yet to come about pooling a resource of information and care. Yeah. And then another version of this kind of like, again, predecessor or like something that's not totally worked out is Colin's List, which I started kind of just as like a person who was traveling all over the world that needed temporary places to stay. But yeah, that I wanted to kind of give people the opportunity to find each other and create like housing networks. Unfortunately, this was on Facebook. I tried to take it off of Facebook, but it's a lot of work. I have to say, like any kind of decentralized work, I mean, it's getting a lot easier with Web3 and Discord and creating DAOs on there, but it takes real work, and it takes just people who are willing to spend the time and energy. And just a little Ursula Le Guin wisdom. Yeah, we can get into that later. So before we, it's already been 40 minutes, so I'm gonna try to just bookend this this process or this little talk. Here, look, it's Icky. Hi, Icky. Guest visiting artist Icky. So Polari, I want to just sort of maybe talk a little bit about this thing that's sort of on the precipice for me, or sort of what I'm working on now. So for those of you who don't know, the language Polari, it's a Cant language from the UK that really kind of solidified in the 1920s. And a cant, we always think of cant, a cant, but a cant is the jargon or language of a group often employed to exclude or mislead people outside the group. It may also be called a cryptolect, argot, anti-language, or secret language. Each term differs slightly in its meaning. Their use is inconsistent. So I started getting into Polari. I was like following it and studied a little bit, but essentially it's this criminal queer language from the UK in this time when having queer sex was illegal, by either punishable by being put in a mental institution or in jail, which this language kind of existed out of the sort of funneling. You can see this kind of little graph of all the different things. So essentially there's like 4 groups that led to Polari, and that was queer people, traveler communities, performers, and criminals. So you can kind of see that this, Polari, you've got the theater slang, you've got the Mollies, the traveling showmen of Europe, drag queens, like early, early Round the Horn, which was like maybe when it first started to appear in the public eye. And I started getting really into, so then I started making music. I was invited by the Berlin Rundfunkchor, the state choir, to make music for this orchestra. And I was supposed to make a response to Missa Solemnis by Beethoven, which I didn't really like. And as trying to sort of think like, what is the opposite of the sort of like dominant Catholic language in classical music that, makes up most of the language of classical music from the Western world. I was like, oh, Polari is literally like criminal queer music. So it's like the farthest thing you can get from like saints of the church that was prosecuting these people over many, many years. Here's some examples of like a chant that was built. Nante Polari napi nada Philly days only parni and tuinate on your Todd. Yeah, Tip the Ivy, Tip the Brandy, Namiari, Coliseum Curtains, the Nanaka Tevra Days. So yeah, this is maybe an example of what Polari looks and sounds like. So yeah, I'm into this idea that Polari is a cant language that a cant language is something that hides inside of a pre-existing language. And I like this idea that potentially we can utilize the kind of autonomous together model of choir to create a new cant, or a circumstance in which we can kind of share space and create code as a group, and then have it kind of disseminated through some sort of DAO. And this is sort of what I'm trying to create for this premiere of this new thing that'll happen in February, which will turn into a new record, will essentially also be the sort of continuation or dissemination of something that has like been born from Polari, but then could turn into something else. Oh, Icky, careful. I signed off. Hello. Yeah, and there was also like a kind of controversy of like getting, it's like a lot of the Polari language is about queer sex and avoiding or hating on the police. And there was a little bit of a, they weren't so happy about, or like I should say that one of the leaders of this project was not so happy. And then yeah, so there is this thing about being sneaky. I'm a sneaky Sagittarius. And what else? Yeah, and I think that in this sort of thing of Polari being this kind of analog encryption, it's like before we had, if a DAO is essentially about creating this autonomous organization, which is encrypted, so only the participants actually know how to read or be a part of it. You can imagine then that Polari is the sort of original form, or is one of these early forms of encryption to work with. And then what else do we have? Yeah, Polari being these sort of camouflage ways for socialization and survival, and really thinking about, in this highly mediated, quantified, recorded, surveyed world, how do we create languages and systems of making that can work as camouflage, where it's not just about the world knowing it. And that is also then what brings me to this thing about what killed Polari, or what sort of ended its real existence, was that, you kind of had this weird inversion of a queer politic where, especially in the 1970s with the gay liberation movement that happened in the UK, there was a real disdain, I think, that queer people had towards the campiness and silliness of something like Polari, which was very much about hiding. But then when you take something like queerness and you put it in the very center of the light, and you capitalize it and you turn it into something that's very much about making money, this visibility politic becomes really just about profit. And I'm sort of interested in creating new queer languages or queer subcultures that can exist in the shadows, not out of shame, but out of survival, out of this thing of not wanting to have our culture, our communication co-opted and turned into products to be sold back to us. And I'm ending with this just question mark because, this is something that's in process. I have a lot of questions, a lot of uncertainty about what it means to bring this work into the world and to try to storytell, create this kind of bridge between the digital world and the physical world with choir. I don't know why I make that a binary. It's not separate, they're one. But anyways, maybe I'll stop there. We have like 10 minutes left in the hour. But yeah, thanks for listening, y'all.